class, how we doing? It's Mr. Andrews here. I am going to talk a little bit about crafting a research question because it is so important to what you're doing in the senior project. Everything you do circles around answering this question. And so if you're asking a question that is too obvious, too easy, it's just kind of a silly question, or it's too broad of a question, or even worse, it's too specific of a question, you're going to find that you're going to struggle to either find research, to focus your paper, or to just write something that seems like it's actually adding something to the world, right? So you want your senior project to be meaningful to you, and in order for it to be meaningful, it has to have a good question. So let's look at what a research question does first, okay? So a research question focuses your goals for research. What that means is it will set up whether you are arguing a position, analyzing an issue, or informing your readers. So in other words, it should be telling the readers what exactly your paper is going to be about. Are you going to be arguing that we should do something? Are you going to be arguing that we should think some way about something? Are you just going to be trying to understand an issue, like uh, does does carbon emissions from cars uh, cause more change to climate change than anything else, right? You would be trying to analyze or understand if there's a relationship between them. You wouldn't necessarily be arguing, you would just be understanding. There's a lot of different ways you can go with this paper. So the kind of question you ask will set up what your goal is for the paper. Another thing it does is it limits the extent of your research. You are not expected to know everything about your topic. In fact, it would be crazy to suggest that you will know everything about your topic. You won't. So what you do need to know and be an expert in is what about the topic you're interested in, and what about the topic is going to be what your research question limits you to. So by crafting a specific question, I want to really highlight that word specific there, right? You limit just how much you need to cover about your topic, just how much you need to share. And a lot of students come to me and say, look, Mr. Andrews, I don't want to make too specific of a question because then I'm not going to have enough to write about. The truth is that I have written on very specific topics for hundreds of pages. There is tons you can say on any given topic. And to give too broad of a question so that you can just come up with a reason to keep writing, that's a silly thing to do. What you really want to do is come up with as specific a question as possible, because in general, you're still going to have plenty to write about if you're doing the work, okay? If you ask too broad a question, and asking that broad question, like what are going to be the impacts of global climate change? Holy crap, guys. Really? You think in like a 6 to 8 page paper, you're going to cover all of that? Probably not. You're going to be scratching the surface at best, right? That sounds easy and tempting because it's like, there's so much to write about. That's true. But at the end of the day, I'm going to come back and say, you didn't answer that question very well, because as a reality, to answer that question, you probably have to write a 1,000-page book, right? So we want to come up with something more specific than that. So for instance, to what extent does cattle farming in Texas impact global climate change? Right? That's much more specific, much more focused. And believe it or not, you could probably write 6 to 8 pages that are very informative on just that specific topic. So limiting it. Another thing it does is creates value for your research, right? If you're writing about something very specific and obscure that somebody doesn't quite know about, like the impacts of cattle farming in Texas on climate change, right? That sounds really obscure. It also creates value for your research because I actually don't know how much cattle farming in Texas is impacting global climate change. I would be interested in knowing about that. Whereas we all know some of the basics of climate change, right? So you're creating value for your research by writing about something that isn't obvious, that doesn't have an obvious answer. Another way to think about this is you want to go beyond the Googleable. So what are some common flaws? The first one is a lot of students fall into that. They just want to push the easy button and call it a day. And I know you're seniors and I know it's tempting, but the reality is that you want to go beyond the Googleable. What that means is if I can Google your question and get an easy, agreed upon answer, that is a flawed question, because there's no point in doing research on it when we could all just find the answer on Google. But if you ask a question, right, that has a lot of different answers that are conflicting, or it doesn't have a clear or ready answer made for it, right? If you can't just Google that question and find an easy, obvious answer to it, then we're looking at a great research question. We're looking at something with value. So a flawed example would be, what are the current projections for changes to the global climate, right? We all know what the current projections are. If you Google it, you can find several resources that suggest what those are. A corrected example would be, to what extent does the U.S. cattle industry affect current climate change projections, right? So that example I mentioned before, a little less obvious. It also should not be a leading question. You may remember straw man fallacies. That's where you set up a sort of like simplistic version of another side, right? If you do that, you're in danger of kind of biasing your argument. If you're writing a paper then that asks a question that's a leading question, um, and it's not specific enough, it can really be a flawed question. So, for example, why do English teachers get it wrong? Like, as personal as I might take that question, what it really comes down to is this question assumes that teachers get it wrong, right? So by assuming that, you're kind of setting up a straw man kind of argument. Instead, you want to ask an open-ended question. This doesn't mean that you won't argue that English teachers get it wrong, but you're not gonna assume that in the question. You're gonna leave it open. So a corrected example is a little more specific. To what extent do public school English classrooms prepare students for career readiness? Maybe your answer is they don't, and here's why. But at least you're not assuming that from the beginning, right? Another thing you want to do is emphasize depth over breadth. It can be really tempting to jump on a very large topic and to look at a very broad question like what is climate change, like this one up here, because you think I'm going to have a lot more to write about. But the reality is that as small and specific as a topic might be, right, you can go pretty deep with it. If you look into the research, you're going to find that most topics that appear to be very small in nature, like this iceberg, actually underneath probably have a lot more to say and a lot more to examine. You just have to go beneath the surface, right? So we're talking about going beyond the obvious, here are the top results and Google kind of thing, but actually getting into, let's look down the list a little bit. Let's do some database searching and find that other data that might give us a little more depth to our topic. So a flawed example of this would be, what are the impacts of global warming, right? That's a pretty broad topic. That's huge. That's an entire continent that we would be covering, right? Instead, we want to land on a tiny little iceberg so we can go all the way down and get this whole sucker mapped, right? So if we were to look at a more specific topic, to what extent does current climate change projections impacts efforts, to what extent will current climate change projections impact efforts to improve agriculture in Africa? So now we're looking at the impacts of climate change on improving agriculture in Africa. That's like a much more specific topic. And while it might seem small, will we be able to write 6 to 8 pages about this, Mr. Andrews? Absolutely. Start doing the research. You're going to find that beneath the surface, there's a lot more to say. So another thing you want to do, and you're going to be asked to do this in your driving question workshop, is to choose a specific lens to craft your question. And by the way, I'm going to stop right here to tell you that the password for today is gorilla. Okay, so gorilla is the password. All of the following of these specific lenses, right, examine the same topic. So you want to think about a lens as being like a way of approaching or looking at your topic. If you go to the eye doctor, right, they'll ask you to look at one or two. Does this look fuzzy or clear, right? The lens changes the way we see things. Likewise, the way we look at our topic is going to change the way we approach everything, right? So for instance, if I were looking at the SAT as a test, but I wanted to look at it from a socioeconomic or historic lens, I have my concept map from last time. I decided I really liked that area, right? I'm going to come up with questions that look at it from that perspective. Does the new SAT still favor wealthier students who attend better schools, right? That's looking at it more from like socioeconomics. That's looking at it from historical lens. If I wanted to look at it from like politics or ethics, right? Should the SAT be run by a government agency or a private company? Educational lens. Is the new SAT essentially a high school exit exam? And so on and so forth. Even economic lens, right? What effects do the SAT have on the economy and who benefits financially? These are more specific ways of looking at the question. And one way to do that is to maybe decide, okay, maybe I want to approach it from one of these perspectives or two of these perspectives, because I like that, right? I want to look at cattle farming, but I want to look at it from more of an economic lens, right? How can we improve cattle farming in terms of economics? So there are other types of questions you can do too, and the type of question you ask can also determine the paper you write. So once you've come up with, okay, I've got a topic, it's specific, I've got a perspective I want to look at. Now you want to think about what type of question do you want to ask. So these are 3 steps that we're going to be taking in the driving question workshop, and I'll be showing you that here in a second. So the first one is theoretical question, right? This is one that's based in theory. So I start with a set of ideas to explain facts or events, right? So let me give you an example here. Ooh, this is terrible. You can't even read it. Well, if you could read this, it says, how was the method, a popular tool for actors to tap into their characters' thoughts and motives, affected the 21st century? So in other words, they're asking, like, how is this one theory about acting affected the way that actors did acting in the 21st century? Another one would be like a causal question. A causal question is a question that asks about a relationship between 2 things. Do they affect each other, right? So to what extent does constant exposure to screens affect the concentration of users when they're performing screenless tasks? How much does all these screens that we have in front of us affect our ability to pay attention, right? That's looking at the cause and effect of something. A historical question then focuses on the origins of something. Where does something come from? How has it evolved throughout time, right? So how has affirmative action impacted opportunities for students in the admissions process? So notice those words, how has. This is going to be a paper that sort of tracks the history and development of something, looking at affirmative action and how it's affected students in admission process from its inception to now, right? From the beginning to the end. Relational questions are not cause and effect. They're asking, is there a relationship between 2 things that may not be cause and effect? So to what extent does art reflect culture or shape it, right? Policy questions. Policy questions have to do with what should we do? How should we solve something, right? So how can the U.S. government adapt to new industries in the 21st century? And finally, there's definition or classification questions, right? What makes a millennial? We're just trying to define what is a millennial, right? Another one would be, does free speech mean you can say anything? So that's a question that is meaning-based, right? How do we define free speech? And so doing some research to develop an argument for that would be what we do. We might be making a claim of definition here. So a sample process, right? So let's say that I'm looking at the SAT. I know I'm interested in changes to the SAT specifically. And I am interested, I've come up with all these different questions, right? Notice that I've got these different ones. Each one has its own lens. Each one has its own type of question, right? So this example is, should the SAT be run by a government agency or private company? I'm looking at it from more of a ethical and political lens, right? I'm interested, should it be run through the government? But I'm also asking a policy question. So I've kind of come up with 2 different layers, right, to specify this question, to come up with something more than just, hey, is the SAT okay? Another thing to consider when you're looking at questions is to follow the research, okay? What this means is you might have a specific idea about what the correct answer is or what your answer is to this, but don't just rely on that. The point of this is to actually listen to the research and follow what it says. The point is for you to actually have a process of learning about your topic, and then from that learning, reporting and writing on your findings. It's not to come at this with, I already know the answer and I'm just going to find evidence that proves that. That actually is what we call confirmation bias. And that is the enemy of learning anything, right? We already have an idea. I believe the world is flat, so I'm going to go out and I'm going to find evidence that proves that the world is flat, ignoring all the other evidence, right? So if you find yourself Googling and searching for research that confirms just one position and answer to your question, and you're ignoring all the other research out there, you're not actually conducting good research, right? So let's say that I'm looking at research on the SAT, right? And I find that GPA is a better indicator of readiness. Test prep is a multi-million-dollar industry, right? I find all this information out, right? I might have to develop a new question because I found that my old question actually isn't going to be debatable. It's not going to be something I'm going to be able to prove. I'm actually going to have to listen to the research in forming a new question. or in refocusing my answer, right? So let's go from concept maps to driving questions. You already should have a concept map if you were doing the homework, guys. You should have a concept map that you're working with. With this concept map, I want you to do a couple things. You're going to go to the Google form next that has to do with driving questions. It's called a driving question workshop. I want you to look over your concept map as you're doing this, okay? Examine it and look for patterns that you might have missed when you were creating it. Do you see some interesting patterns? First off, what areas of the map are you most interested in, right? Are you interested in the area where maybe you talked about the economics of climate change as opposed to the ethics of it? What areas of the map is the most information available? Like, where did you find yourself branching out a lot, right? Maybe that's where you may find the most fruitful discussion and research. And after further consideration, I want you to create at least 3 open-ended research questions from the information on your map to test drive. This is what you're going to do in the driving question workshop, though. So go through that, look through it as you go, make sure that you're filling in those fields. I'm going to be providing you video feedback to those on Friday. So make sure that you're putting those in and getting those in by Wednesday so that I can take the time to go through them and give you that feedback. Because guys, you want to have a good question at the end of the day, and I want you to have a good question.